We finished our last talk basically about the beginning of the Council of Trent, and we're going to notice effects of Trent in different sections of the church history as we sort of move along. But I'd like to talk for a moment about my personal perspective on the Council of Trent. I believe there are two major things the Council of Trent did. The first of all was the formation of seminaries and setting up standards for the education of priests. And that was necessitated by the disastrous response of parish priests to the Reformation. One of the main reasons for the success of the Protestant Reformation was the ignorance of Catholic teaching on the part of Catholic priests. They knew a lot about legends and stuff like that. You know, I would tell you, when I was a little boy, in the parish that I was in San Diego, the Monsignor was a beloved person. Everyone liked him. He was a very good person. But if I were to go through the entire period when I was a child till about the age of 18, I only heard two kinds of sermons. One was a sermon on the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was very big. Now remember, that's the time of the Cold War, and Fatima was where Mary had prophesied that communism would just inwardly collapse of its own in time. And so that was very, very strong. And the other were sermons asking for money. But all sermons were one of those two things. We didn't get a lot of, in fact, we didn't get any theology. And the thing that was number two for me is the Tridentine canon. What we call the Eucharistic prayer today used to be called the canon. And it was in Latin when I was a youngster and being raised. And the reason why this was so important was Mass was being celebrated very differently in many parts of the world. And so when Trent put together the Tridentine Latin canon, it was mandated throughout the world. And you had to have a canon or a Eucharistic prayer much, much older. I think it had to be at least 1,000 years old, or you couldn't use it. So there are some small communities that have their own Eucharistic prayer. But other than that, the Tridentine canon became the major thing all over the world. And the reason why that is important to me actually happened at the Second Vatican Council. Because at the Second Vatican Council, what they did was set about reforming the liturgy throughout the entire church, and they could only do that because there was one liturgy used throughout the entire church. And if you watch the way the liturgy was changed, we have English here and Spanish in Mexico and Spanish congregations here, and German in Germany and French in Canada or France. But the fact of the matter is that the prayer is the same. All we have is a different translation, but the prayer is the same. And that was only possible because Trent set it up this way and brought all the Eucharistic prayers together. The story of the Spanish conquest of native peoples in the Americas is not a very enlightened story. I don't know if I've mentioned this here, but my family background is Native American, and we were converted by French Jesuits who were very influenced by a man called Ricci, who preached in China. And as a result of that, the Native Americans who were converted all over the eastern part of Canada were all converted by these French missionaries. And it's a very benevolent experience we have of them. In fact, it's interesting that if you look at the missionary work that they did, there are a lot of martyrs. The North American martyrs are all French Jesuits. But it's because they came without soldiers. On the West Coast, where we had the Spanish, and throughout South America, there's strong feelings against the church. And it's because the Spanish came with soldiers, and this is why. Many of them came looking for personal profit and certainly for profit for Spain. But because of the situation in Spain, what was going on in Spain is there were two leaders, Ferdinand and Isabella, and they had reconquered Spain. And in the reconquest of Spain, they took it away from the Ottoman Turks. And reconquering Spain, they reestablished the Catholic Church. But again, because they had moved in there by military, they had this military model. And once they took over Spain, if you were a Jew or a Protestant or a Muslim, you could convert or you could leave. They were the whole thing. So they didn't murder these people, but they told the people you had to leave, and they would leave Spanish. For the Spanish, it was not possible to be Spanish without being Catholic. And so they sent them out. And the system was set up that way. While very dedicated missionaries came to the United States, came to Western America, and were responsible for the conversions and stuff, in general, the experience was very bad. When you begin to look back and study it, I was asked to give a talk on it by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles to all the priests and bishops in the Archdiocese at one point. And one of the things I noticed about this as I began to study it was that if you track down the stories about the missionaries that are really, really violent and awful, they are almost inevitably stories about the soldiers that have been somehow transferred into the missionaries. Now, you have to be honest, the soldiers wouldn't have been here if the missionaries didn't come. But the fact of the matter is, the real problems were, in fact, these soldiers. One of the great conquistadors was a man by the name of Bartholomew Las Casas, and he was working in Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They were one at the time. And he quickly noticed that while the soldiers allowed the missionaries to preach, they did not allow them to interfere in the abuse of the natives who were enslaved. And I'll tell you how it happened. I'll use Father Sarah. So the mission here is established, Mission San Luis Obispo. If you were a Native American and you came in, the Native Americans in this area incidentally were Chumash. If you came into the mission and you were converted, you were under the protection of the priests. If you did not convert, then the army could enslave you. But once you were enslaved, you wouldn't be allowed to convert. Now, if you were converted in the mission and you were outside the mission territories or had run away from the mission or something, the soldiers could seize you and enslave you. And that's one of the reasons why the missionaries tried very hard to keep the natives on the property of the missions in order to protect them from enslavement. But those two things went on side by side. Indians were dying of disease and harsh treatment. And in fact, in our area here, 90% of all the Native Americans died. And 90% of them died. They died from disease and from the harsh treatment. This man, Bartholomew, was ordained a priest in 1510 and immediately began to go to work for the protection of these natives. He was able to persuade the Emperor Charles V to the king in Spain, Charles V, to pass laws forbidding slavery. Slavery was forbidden, as well as forced labor. Forced labor was not the same as slavery, but it was really close. It was like the serfs. You were attached to the land. You had to work the land in order to survive. Later alterations to these laws made them ineffective. But he's remembered always as the universal protector of all Indians. He tried to pass these laws and was able to persuade the king to do so. But one of the difficulties that took place at that time, and we'll notice this with Father Sarah, that when Father Sarah was involved in the missions in California, whenever there was a conflict between the soldiers and the mission. An example would be the soldiers would kidnap a particular woman off the mission grounds and take her off as a slave. And Father Sarah would try and intervene, and of course the soldiers had guns, the missionaries didn't. So he would not be very successful. But if he took his case to the authority, and the authority at the time was in Mexico City, he won them. Every single case he won. But now he had to travel to Mexico City or send the case with someone to Mexico City and then bring back the thing. While he won every case, more than half the cases, either the Native American was dead or the soldier had been transferred by the time the decision came back, so it didn't much matter. But largely it was communication. Originally the communication had to go to Spain, and then it had to go to the Viceroy in Mexico City. But in either case, it took too long from California. In 1549, Francis Xavier was a young man in Spain and was one of the very first people to join Ignatius of Loyola when he was forming the Jesuit order. Pope Paul II named him the Pope's personal legate. The reason was he wanted to preach the gospel where the gospel had never been preached. And so he wanted to go off to the Orient. So he worked first in India and then in Japan. And there are Catholic churches in India. The southern section of India is very Catholic, and that begins with Francis Xavier, although they trace their origin back to the Apostle Thomas. The legend is the Apostle Thomas came in and started the faith in southern India. But whatever it was, the massive amounts there are from Francis Xavier. And then he went to Japan and was able to make very few converts in Japan. One of the interesting things about Japanese society is it is very regulated and not forced. Like, for instance, I was in Japan last year for about a month, and it's amazing how everything is done in very set ways. Everything takes place, and you don't get the feeling anyone is ordered to do it or obliged to do it or anything. This is just like if you were to ask someone, this is the way it's done. You know, we haven't been told it, this is what you do. And Japanese society is very much like that. So it was very, very difficult to convert them to being Christians in that largely Buddhist society. The Buddhist monks thought he must be ignorant because he was dressed so poorly. And so Francis adopted the robes of a Buddhist holy man. Now remember, I told you about Rinzai in China. Remember, he adopted the clothing of an educated Chinese leader, okay? He adopted the clothing of that because that's how they respected them. And so the Francis Xavier does it in Japan. He adapted his dress, and there were over 1,000 Catholics in Japan when he left for China. A little bit about his going for China. He left for China on the missionary effort. He became very, very sick. And they stopped at an island for a few days before going into China. It's an island on the coast of China. I have no idea the name of it anymore. But anyway, they stopped there. And as they were getting ready to go on with the missionary work on the way to China, he was dying. So they were not going to, take him on the ship and everything. And he insisted they take him down to the beach so he could watch from the beach while the ship was being taken off. Because he says, it doesn't really matter whether I live or die as long as I'm a part of what God's doing. So he says, if we're going to China, I'm going to die on the way to China. I'm not going to die in the bed here. So they brought him to the beach. He died there. And what they did was bury him. They were afraid that his body would be somehow desecrated. I don't really know what the whole thing was. So they buried his body, covered it in lime, and then buried it right on the beach there. He never reached China, as I mentioned. He's remembered as the most successful missionary since St. Paul. In his life, he baptized thousands of people. In fact, there are several occasions where he writes in his notes, he kept very extensive records, all Jesuits did. Like what we know about the United States and everything is the Jesuit records that were sent to France. And I think you know the early missionaries in California, rather moving up through Mexico and South America, were Jesuits. When the Jesuit order was suppressed, we covered that earlier, they were replaced by Franciscans and Dominicans. But up till that, the missionaries were Jesuits. And the Jesuits, I don't know whether it's an obligation or not, but they sent back these letters with great frequency to Spain. And what we know about early Mexico and South America, and what we know about the Aztecs and these civilizations that they literally destroyed as they came in, we know from the letters of the Jesuit missionaries. And this was true of Francis Xavier. We have a huge knowledge of both Japan and India, largely of that time, largely from his records. I'll tell you a final story about him. He baptized people, sometimes so many, that his right arm would be paralyzed, which was the arm that was used for baptism. And I think on the 1000th anniversary of his, no, be 400 years, 1949. It would be 400 years of his missionary work. What they did, the people asked that the body of St. Francis be sent so the relic, the entire relic, could travel the missionary journey he went through India, through Japan, and then to that island, and then return. His relics had been dug up, and when they dug it up, they found his body perfectly preserved, in spite of the lie. And so they had taken his body to Rome. He's buried in a church called the Gesù, which is the Jesuit church in Rome. There are lots of Jesuit churches now, but that was the first one. And Gesù just means Jesus. So it's called the Gesù. And he's buried there. They were so afraid that the relic would be kept, because that relic was so important that they would not allow the body to go. So what they did was cut off the right arm. This thing of relics, I think, sounds very macabre to us today. But anyway, it was a big thing then. So they cut off the right arm and created a reliquary holding the right arm. And that reliquary went and toured, you know, the areas, all this sort of thing, and then was taken back and put back, laid back on the body that is laying investments in the Gesù. One of the really curious things about it is when you go in there today, the body of Francis Xavier is still incorrupt. The body's there, incorrupt. But the arm that was cut off, withered. And the arm there looks, you know, as though any arm would after it was disintegrated. I always found that fascinating. I hope it doesn't upset your dinner if that's what you're at today. Anyway, in 1550, the Jesuits had grown to over 100 houses worldwide, and they were doing great missionary work and educating seminarians. Originally, the Jesuit schools were founded to train only Jesuits, because the Jesuits themselves, remember, wanted to be involved in missionary work. But so they were doing just educating Jesuits. But soon their great ability as teachers caused everyone to seek out Jesuit schools, and the schools were open to everyone. And I don't know if you know this, but Jesuit schools were all over the Mideast. And again, because they were excellent educators. You find Jesuit schools in the areas, the Muslim areas of that used to be part of Israel and that area, Palestine. In Palestine, you find Jesuit schools, and they obviously were built there and everything when the area was mainly Muslim. The University of Baghdad was a Jesuit school, and that's because they were such fantastic educators. And I think I told you that because of Ricci and the Chinese respect for the Jesuits, the Jesuit house in China stayed throughout the entire Chinese Revolution, everything is still there today. The Jesuits are in that house, but as educators and dealing largely there with astronomy. But they are there as educators, not there to teach the Catholic faith. That's not why they're there. But if you could get in a Jesuit school, you know, like when I was a youngster in San Diego, I went to St. Augustine's, which is an Augustinian school, and they're great educators, everything like that. But I remember I talked to my grandmother in Canada once I had been accepted into the Augustinian school, and her first question was, aren't there any Jesuit schools? And that's because they don't have Augustinian schools up there, they have Jesuit, but we didn't in San Diego. So anyway, Ignatius founded the Roman College and the German College, both for the training of priests, and they strongly built everything on philosophy and theology, and they became models for all the seminaries. Incidentally, in Rome, there are a series of seminaries that are for different nations, and it used to be that if you were in the United States, for instance, the bishops would look around. If you were a bishop in your diocese, you would look to see whether you had a man you thought was exceptional enough that he would make a good bishop. And if so, you would send him to study in the North American College, which is the one for Americans. Or they would send them from the Dutch college, as I mentioned here, the German college, the Roman college. The Roman college is for Italians. And they would send them to the colleges so they could be educated close to the center of the church. Today, if you've had that kind of an education, it's good, and you may well be made a bishop. But oftentimes today, they make a person a bishop who's simply gone through our education system. We have good seminaries throughout the world now. And so they tend to do that today. The first Dutch Jesuit is a man by the name of Peter Canisius. He's a saint, incidentally. And he's known as the second apostle of Germany. It's his work in the country that ended the tide of the Reformation. When we talk about the Reformation, we can talk about the tide. What's the tide of the Reformation? The tide of the Reformation is how the Reformation moved and took over Catholic churches, drove out the Catholic clergy, and put in Protestant clergy. That's the tide. When the tide stopped, there are still many missionaries that went out into Catholic areas and developed Lutheran churches and stuff like that. That never stopped, but it wasn't a conquest thing. And at that point, and we'll see it a little later, once they settled this thing and everyone stopped killing one another over it, there were Catholic pockets all over Protestant Germany and Protestant pockets all over Catholic Germany. It was much like the United States. You go to a town, you have a Catholic church, you have a Lutheran church, this sort of thing. But the tide stopped with the Jesuits. And one of the interesting things is if you take a map of Germany and draw the Jesuit houses across Germany and put a line through it, you've separated Catholic from Protestant Germany. The Jesuit education just stopped that. The Protestant Reformation at this point continued to strengthen in Germany. And the Lutheran princes, many of the princes were Lutheran, and they were opposed to the Emperor Charles V. And so their opposition to Charles V caused them to have a lot of control over him. The solution to the growing conflicts between Catholics and Lutherans was the whoever rules law that was passed at Augsburg. The whoever rules law is in Latin called cuius regis. That's who's ever in charge. And what happened would be if we in San Luis Obispo, if our mayor, only it would be a large area like a prince, let's use the governor. If our governor in California was a Catholic, then the official religion of California would be Catholicism. And Catholicism would be supported by taxes in the whole area. That doesn't mean that Lutherans would be forbidden, but the official religion would be Catholic. If it happened that our governor was Lutheran, then our territory would legally be Lutheran, and tax money would be used to support the Lutheran churches. Now, you could have Catholic churches, and they'd be Catholic congregations, there'd be no problem with that, but they were not the official religion and were not supported by the government, okay? And you would find something like that in Spain, where the Catholic Church is supported by the government. You'd find something like that in Italy, where the Catholic Church is supported by the government. You'd find the Church of England, the Anglicans, supported by the government in England. You'd find the Lutherans supported in most of Scandinavia, Denmark, Holland, these countries, okay? So, but that doesn't mean that the others are forbidden anymore. Now, it just means that the government officially recognizes one. The religion of any area was determined simply by the religion of the ruling prince. This agreement ended the conflicts between Catholics and Lutherans. However, Calvinism was not recognized in the agreement. With the Peace of Augsburg, the agreement of the idea of Luther, of Europe, always united under a single faith, died. The idea that there would be a single faith in Europe was over at this point, period, done. In 1562, the Council of Trent concluded, and among the definitions, the Council of Trent defined the books accepted as inspired by the Church and confirmed that tradition itself was a legitimate source of truth. Tradition is sort of what we've passed down in our communities, and it's a legitimate source of truth. It's not truth in the same way the Bible is, but there's some truth. It's like, for instance, if we were to take legends of George Washington, if you take the legends of George Washington that have passed down, and some of them are fairly fantastic. I think you know about the cherry tree when he's a little boy and stuff like this, some very fantastic stories. But there must be a ring of truth somehow to them that started the stories, okay? To say that he was a very honest man, I think is true. And that story embodies the honesty of him. But when we look at these stories, so we believe in the Catholic Church, tradition actually is a source of truth. So I guess if I were to take an example of a tradition, traditionally the names of Jesus's grandparents are Joachim and Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Joachim are the grandparents of Jesus, and the names have come through tradition. And there's no reason to believe those aren't the names. It's not a big, important thing, but there's no reason to believe that those aren't the names. This idea, the definition of the books, too, caused a and I don't know how to say that. In Catholic doctrine, the basic Catholic doctrine is we believe everything the Bible teaches. Okay, we basically believe everything the Bible teaches. And the only time the Catholic Church declares a doctrine is when two people cannot agree on what a text teaches. I'll give you an example. We in the Catholic Church teach that there are three persons in one God, and that comes from the baptismal text. When Jesus is teaching the apostles, he says, baptize them in the name of the Father. Baptize them in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Now, if you look at that, it should read, baptize them in the names of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It should be plural. The fact of the matter is, in the days of Jesus, the word name was used to replace God's name, Yahweh. And the reason they did that, because you could not say that sacred name. So they replaced it by saying the name. So we have prayers, hallowed be thy name. What do they mean about God's being named holy? They're talking about God's holy. He is holy. But rather than do that, they say name. So he's basically saying, baptize them in God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So we understand there's a Trinity in God, okay? Now, there's another verse in the Bible, in the Christian scriptures, that says, where Jesus is speaking, he says, the Father is greater than I. Now, if they are two persons in one God, one person can't be greater than the other. And so they will say that no, there's only one person, that's the Father. He is God, and that Jesus is his Son. And I think that's largely held by the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. So you'd have these two groups arguing about it. And what the church would do is have a council and decide it. And the decision of the church on the part of the Father is greater than I is because Jesus is human. He can speak from his humanity. And when he speaks from his humanity, God is greater than he is. But if he speaks from his divinity, as he will at times say, the Father and I are one. Okay? But anyway, you hold a council, and a lot of people will look at a council and say, that's an awful late time to decide on a truth. Let's say the idea of Mary being assumed into heaven was decided, I think, in 1955, maybe 1950. I think probably 55. But anyway, it was declared a doctrine then. They say that's awfully late. But the fact of the matter is, that's the first time any Catholic questioned it. Once it becomes discussed, then we decide it. So one of the first things the council did was define the number of books in the Bible. Why did they do that? The first person to question the number of books in the Bible was Luther. And when Luther began to question them, remember Luther talked about salvation by faith alone. Well, Luther wanted to drop the Epistle of James from the book. And the Epistle of James, he says, faith without works is worthless. So Luther wanted to drop that. He didn't think that came from God. He was unsuccessful in dropping that. He also wanted to drop the book of Revelation. He said it was too spacey. And he was unsuccessful in that. But several books in the Jewish scriptures he was capable of dropping. And an example of one is Maccabees. Luther really didn't like the idea of prayers for the deceased. Incidentally, the reason Luther didn't like it was priests were charging money. You give me so much money, I'll pray for your deceased aunt and get her out of purgatory. And so people would contribute money. So Luther hated the idea of selling prayers and stuff. It's one of the major changes he brought about. And so he didn't like the idea of praying for the dead, so he wanted to drop that. And he was successful in dropping several books out of the Jewish scriptures. And the reason is, in the Jewish scriptures, the oldest Jewish scriptures are in Hebrew, but at a certain point, the Jews began speaking Greek. It was a Greek world. It was the educated language. Like, for instance, Jesus probably did not speak much Greek, but people in his day who wrote in Greek. That's why the entire Christian scriptures are written in Greek, okay? Even though it was Jewish authors, they were written in Greek. So when the community Greek became the language, then the inspiration the prophets got was in Greek. And so we have several books. Well, Luther maintained those that were originally in Greek had to be dropped. And so that's where they were. And that's why there's a difference between the two Bibles. But anyway, this is the first time that the books were clearly defined. It reaffirmed regular Catholic beliefs. There's one God, Trinity stuff. It reaffirmed general Catholic beliefs. And this is the time when they established diocesan seminaries. So the seminary was not Dominican or Jesuit or Franciscan. It was in a diocese. And I told you, in a diocese, the way people were ordinarily educated is I would present myself to the pastor, and he would have me work with him around the parish. And after a while, if he thought I was ready to be a priest, he sent me off to be ordained. Okay? There were a number of other issues, all having to do with the reform of the clergy and the reform of the church. The idea of selling indulgences and stuff, all those things that Luther pointed out those were dealt with in the Council of Trent. The council opened in 1545 with 60 council fathers present and ended in 1562 with over 260 council fathers present. In the interval, we had a plague, we had a war, several large wars. So the council broke up several times for this and was finally reassembled and finished at that time. In 1566 now, Paul V, the Dominican, became Pope. He set about making sure the decrees of the council were observed throughout the church. When we have a church council, the most important individual is the man who becomes Pope after the council. Because the man who runs the council is a visionary, John the 23rd, a visionary of a great church in the future and all this sort of thing. And so he organized this council. But the man who followed him was Paul VI. And Paul VI set about trying to make sure everyone followed the council. You had to go with the vernacular. And he guided the church in many of the decrees. There's still more than half of the Second Vatican Council has not yet been enacted, but a good part of it is being enacted by Francis, by his lifestyle. Pope Francis today is really projecting all that by his lifestyle. And the way Francis is living, he is so popular and so universally loved that he is inspiring priests and bishops to follow his lifestyle, which is his way of reforming the church. Paul VI did it by legislation, but Francis seems to be doing it by example. Some countries did not allow the decrees to be published. And as with any reform in the church, there's always opposition. But some governments would not allow the decrees to be published in their country, largely because they benefited much from the way the church was run that time. They liked the idea of selling the office of bishop and stuff like that. The Pope also tried to reform the Curia, which is the papal court. And this is the group of people who advise and really run the church. They're supposed to run it in harmony with the Pope, but they really run the church. And the reform of the Curia has been an ongoing thing throughout history. You know that they say power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the Curia. The Curia over a period of time becomes very corrupt. And over again, when Francis became Pope, he said his priority was the reform of the Curia. And it's just not an easy thing to do, because if you get out the corrupt people, you bring in new people who are corrupted by the power they get once they get in there. It's just a very, very difficult thing. So he abolished useless orders and began encouraging others. Some orders became like country clubs, where you would go there and have a nice, comfortable living and everything. They had girlfriends who visited them. Just a very, very comfortable thing. And they called it a monastery. So he said, no, okay? You had to see what they were doing with regards to the church. That was true with convents, too, as well. And he issued a new missal in 1570. That new missal is the Latin canon I talked to you about earlier that united the church. Now, at this time, the Turks, who had just been driven out of Spain now, organized a massive fleet of ships to invade Europe. The troops of the Turks had been coming across Europe, but had been stopped at the Battle of Belgrade. So their advance ended there, and that was the termination of it. The Pope appealed to the Roman houses of Europe to defend against the fleet, but actually they were really involved in their own wars. And no one at that time, Christian countries were fighting one another, and no one at that time wanted to give troops or anything to the Pope to help defend the papal states. Remember, they were at this time angry with the church seeking its independence, as we saw after the Council of Trent. So they would have been just as happy to see the papacy ended and the papal states fall. However, Don Juan of Austria agreed to lead the fleet against the Turks. Now, Don Juan, as you know, is famous for other things, but that's exactly the same man. Don Juan was Spanish, but Spain controlled Austria at the time. So, and Don Juan is buried in the Escorial in Spain today. But anyway, so he agreed. He was a minor royal person and not a very good reputation or anything, but the Pope couldn't do anything else, so he called him in. Now, the Pope called on all Catholics to pray the rosary, to intercede with Mary for a Catholic victory. I want you to know that every religious order has what we call a corona. And a corona is a rosary. Different rosaries have different numbers of beads, different prayers you say on them. Many people today know the Rosary of Divine Mercy, for instance. But there are all sorts of different rosaries, and they're called coronas. And the Dominican corona is the one we call a rosary. Okay? Now, this Dominican Pope asked everyone to pray the Dominican corona for the thing. It came to be called a rosary, largely because while the Dominican Pope was Pope, and his rosary had become really popular, when people went to Rome, one of the souvenirs they wanted was a rosary blessed by the Pope. So a lot of convents and things in Rome began to make rosaries, and the way they made them, they took rose petals, dried them, and using paste, molded these little tiny beads. And you can still buy rosaries like that in Rome that smell like roses. But anyway, because these rosaries or coronas were being made out of these and smell like roses, they came to be called rosaries. So the Dominican rosary is today called a rosary. So I had everyone pray it. The Turkish fleet encountered a massive storm just before the battle. Their ships, remember at that time it's difficult to recognize one ship for another, their ships ended up firing on one another and they were destroyed, much like happened to the Spanish Armada as they were going to England. And so the victory was attributed to the praying of the rosary. And on the day the news of that victory reached Rome, they celebrated the victory by creating the Feast of the Most Holy Rosary. We celebrate each year, I forget the date, we celebrate the Feast of the Most Holy Rosary. But the Feast of the Most Holy Rosary is the day on which the news reached Rome that the Muslim fleet was defeated. Almost every religious community, as I mentioned, has their own. And it's because of this and because of the feast, when we think of rosary, we think of the Dominican Rosary. In 1555, even before Pius VII, there were a series of popes known as the Counter-Reformation popes, and they all worked for the reforms that would be finalized in Trent. By the Counter-Reformation means they were against the Protestant Reformation. So what they did was look at the Protestant Reformation and find out what brought it about in the Catholic Church that needed to be changed. And they set about doing this. They're known as the Counter-Reformation popes, really wonderful people and powerful leaders who went about this kind of reform. It's kind of good. You know, when you look back, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is that for those who love God, everything works together for good. The Reformation was hugely beneficial to the Catholic Church. And the Reformation is the reason we had the Council of Trent. It's the reason we have seminaries. It's the reason we have the liturgy the way we do. And what happened is, it's also the reason we had the Second Vatican Council, which a lot of other things they were interested in, the vernacular and the liturgy. All these things came about. And if the troops of the Catholic princes had been able to defeat and destroy the troops of the Lutheran princes, we would have gone on as normal. No one would have attempted the reform. But thanks be to God, the Lutherans were not defeated. And not being defeated, they forced us to become a church again after the heart of Jesus Christ. When these things happen, you can either reform or rebel. And it's the same thing in your life if something goes wrong. In fact, I'll just show you right now, with the coronavirus going on, we have our choice between two things. We can really react violently against it, against something we can't do anything about. Or we can learn from it, how we can work together, how we can better fight diseases like this, how we'll be better prepared for another pandemic. We can learn from it and react to it. But we can just fight it and yell about it and wait for a vaccine, whenever that comes. So as we noted earlier in this study, there were many individuals for whom the reform of the church was a personal goal, particularly as they became pope. They worked as pope for the reform of the church. Paul V, he was pope from 1555 to 1559. He was a man who worked for the reform and tried to stop the spread of the Protestant Reformation, and was a person who reformed his own life. The problem was he was very austere and seemed to love power. He was quarrelsome, and the Council of Trent never once met during his reign. It's really good, because while he was very interested in personal reform, when you study great saints in the Catholic Church, great saints are very strict on themselves and very lenient and gentle with other people. Many people who become strict on themselves become mean and austere with other people. And that's what happened with this man. And had he been alive during the council would have reflected this. Paul IV in 15 called the council together, and he wanted them to concentrate on the role of the bishops. He was to be a kind and a generous man who led all by, this is Paul V. He led all people by, first of all, by his example, much like we see Pope Francis doing today. Charles Borromeo was the nephew of Pius IV. He received church offices at the age of 12. That means he was receiving monies he was named an abbot of a monastery or something. He became a cardinal at the age of 22. He loved and lived the high life. At the age of 25, he was ordained. Now, I told you that he became a cardinal at 22. Remember, a cardinal means you're entitled to vote for the Pope. You don't have to be a priest to be a cardinal. So he wasn't. Today, all of them are priests. So at 25, he was ordained, and he read the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, and was completely transformed and began a very strict spiritual life. He took an important role in the sessions in Trent. He insisted on residing in his diocese in Milan. Sounds silly, if you're Bishop of Milan, wouldn't you reside there? He was the first bishop to reside in the city in over a century. Usually they took the revenue from the thing and they lived in Rome. Rome was the city to live in, and then you could be in on the politics. He established several seminaries and organized an educational society for teaching. He took very long visits and would travel around his own diocese. No matter how remote the parish was, he visited it. And when a plague struck Milan, he took care of the sick personally. He became the ideal bishop envisioned by Trent. And even today, Charles Borromeo and that man, the bishop I mentioned in Geneva, Switzerland, can't remember his name now. The one the Salesians are named after. But he and Charles Borromeo are today considered the ideal bishops. When they look at a bishop, that's who they look to. So anyway, we'll stop it there and pick it up next week. Thank you very much.